Welcome everyone. I'm Dolores Donnelly, Community Development Officer with Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council. Thank you for attending our lecture series tonight. The lecture series, Rippling Effects of the Great Irish Famine, is being delivered by Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council through its Community Development Department, which is part financed by the Executive Office of Northern Ireland. Tonight's guest speaker is Ciarán Reilly. Ciarán is a lecturer in Maynooth University, and tonight we'll be talking on the subject of monsters and ogres evicting the poor during Ireland's Great Famine. Accompanying us also is our guest, weekly speaker, Gerard McAtasney. Welcome, Ciarán. If you'd like to commence your talk whenever you're ready,
Yeah,
I appreciate
perfect.
it. Now, just bear with me for one moment. That's great. Are you okay there, Ciarán?
Yeah, can you see that?
Yeah, perfect.
Absolutely.
Your Can you maximize your screen? Is that it maybe? Because we can see the slides. Yeah,
I will do. Yeah, is that
brilliant.
better?
That's
Very
great. Thank you
good.
very much, Ciarán.
Super. Okay, good evening, everybody. It's great to be here again. I was part of last year's series as well, and just to commend Dolores and Gerard from the outset. It's wonderful to see so many numbers on a weekly basis tuning in for this famine series again this year. So this evening, what I'm going to talk about is research which I've been undertaking over the last, I suppose, 7 or 8 years on the topic of eviction. And the title that I give tonight's talk is Of Monsters and Ogres Evicting the Poor During the Great Famine. And I'll begin with, I suppose, and I think I might have mentioned it last year too, the murder of Major Dennis Mahon in Strokestown in County Roscommon in November 1847 sent shockwaves through Ireland and indeed elsewhere. Major Mahon was the first landlord to be murdered during the course of the Great Famine. And what followed in the weeks and months after his murder in November 1847 was a large-scale process of eviction. Now, evictions had taken place, and there was fears of eviction taking place on the Mahon estate prior to his murder. But what followed was unprecedented. Somewhere in the region of 2,000 to 2,500 people were evicted from the Strokestown estate in the aftermath of the murder of Major Dennis Mahon. The tenants, of course, rejoiced at the murder. One newspaper reported that within an hour of the murder being perpetrated, the several hills were lighted by bonfires in every direction. And Dennis Mahon's murder, it was said, had been carried out after the local parish priest of Strokestown issued a denunciation and said that he was worse than Cromwell, and yet he lived. The murder, as I mentioned, was a cause célèbre, and news flowed across the world. Even Queen Victoria, in her private diary in November 1847, noted, "A shocking murder has again taken place in Ireland. Major Mahon, who had entirely devoted himself to being of use to the distressed Irish, was shot when driving home in his carriage. Really, they are a terrible people. It is a constant source of anxiety and annoyance." So for the tenants in the Strokestown estate, they probably thought that the end of the evictions would come about with the demise of Major Mahon, but that was far from the actuality of what would occur. Tonight's talk, I want, as I said, focus in on evictions across the country, not just in Roscommon, but indeed in all of the 32 counties. Eviction is associated with the famine more than anything. While most pre-famine clearances occurred without publicity, the famine period of 1845 to 1852 would be much different. Newspapers reported widely on the eviction and the levelling of housings, and as we're going to see in the course of the talk tonight, the malevolence of those that carried out the evictions. And while historians have long concerned themselves with ascertaining the exact numbers of those who were evicted, it's probably somewhere in the region of about 250,000 families, or somewhere around 1.2 million people were forcibly removed from the land during those short 7 to 8 years of the Great Irish Famine from 1845 to 1852. Now, there were 4 phases really of evictions during this period, and I think it's important to bear these in mind. The first great phase of eviction in the immediate pre-famine period occurred after the passing of the Irish Poor Act of 1838. And this act, which came on the foot of a British government inquiry into the state of poverty and the state of the poor in Ireland, suggested that workhouses would be built across the country. And we know that 163 workhouses would eventually be built in Ireland before, during, and immediately after the Great Famine. And the beginnings of the workhouse provided the opportunity for landlords to start to evict tenants for a variety of reasons. And we'll touch on the reasons why people may have been evicted in a few moments. The second great phase of evictions occurred in or around 1841, and I couple this with the 1852 elections as well. There was elections in 1847, but the 1841 and 1852 general elections in Ireland were hotly contested elections. And it pitched the landlord and his agent very often against the supporters of Repeal and Daniel O'Connell and the local Catholic clergy. And what followed in the wake of the elections was wide-scale evictions based on the fact that people had publicly declared their interest on election day. This, of course, is prior to the introduction of the Secret Ballot Act of 1870, when people had to publicly declare who they would be voting for. Now, as the famine commenced, landlords and their agents, largely speaking, granted abatements of rent and didn't go to collect arrears of rent and so on. It wasn't until 1840.
Ciarán, can I ask you a question? Sorry, because apologies, my fault. I was just doing something on behalf of somebody in the audience. But when you said people had to did you say people actually had to make it aware who they were going to be voting for? It wasn't private.
Publicly making aware, yeah.
And that would have distorted a lot of. What was the outlook towards that approach? I'm sorry, just I suppose something new to me.
It was something that was widely
very alien to what we think of today. Your vote is a private, confidential matter, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So it very often the landlord or his agent would have the power to sway an election based on the fact that people had to publicly declare who they were voting for.
Okay. No, thank you. Sorry, apologies for interrupting, but I just wanted to get the further clarification on that. Thank you.
Yeah. The third great phase of famine-era evictions occurred after the passing of the Gregory or Quarter-Acre Clause of 1847. And this clause stipulated that holders of a quarter of acre of land or more who wished to enter the workhouse for relief had to forego their land holding. So it allowed landowners the opportunity to begin to clear tenants that were in arrears and those unlikely to ever improve their circumstance. So we can actually chart the rise in evictions after the introduction of the Gregory Act of 1847. And the fourth great phase, which we'll concern ourselves with tonight, commences after 1849. And between 1849 and 1851, 1852, there were large-scale evictions across the country based on the fact that the Encumbered Estates Act or the Encumbered Estates Court had been introduced. This was a court which the British government introduced to try and solve the problem of death in Ireland. Because up until 1849, if you were owed money, it was an arduous process to try to actually bring somebody through the courts. Now, for the first time, if somebody was owed money, they could petition the courts for the sale of an estate based on money that was owed to them. And somewhere in the region of 20 to 25% of the land of Ireland actually changed hands between 1849 and 1858. And the evictions associated with this period were carried out by landowners who wished to clear their lands, firstly, either to make the land profitable for sale, or secondly, by new incoming landowners, those that had purchased estates in the Encumbered Estates Court they began to clear their estates of tenants who remained there because they claimed they had no connection with them, and as new landowners they were entitled to do as they saw fit. So they are the four great phases really in which we can chart famine era evictions. Oh, screen is paused there, Dolores. I'm not sure why. Oh, no, it's gone on to the next one, yeah. Arrears of rent. So why did landlords evict? Well, there's a multitude of reasons why landlords began to evict as the famine crisis deepened. Obviously, arrears of rent and the failure to pay rent was one of the big reasons. Somewhere in the region of 15 to 20% of estates in the east of the country were said to have been in arrears, whereas in the west of the country, the scale of arrears was enormous. Upwards of 60 to 70% of the actual rental went into arrear. Landlords also chose to evict tenants because of the poor law charge, that being the charge that was issued by the local workhouse. Landlords were forced to pay for the upkeep of the local workhouse based on the number of tenants they had on their estate. So to clear the smallholders meant that they removed some of that charge which was placed on their shoulders. Landlords also chose across the country to evict tenants in order to embellish their domain or big house. And so even though in a time of famine, many landowners undertook this process of big house and domain embellishment or building or refurbishment. Landlords also sought to remove people who had been implicated in crime, particularly those who were implicated in murder. And crime levels rose significantly during the famine. If we look at the number of reported crimes in 1848 alone to the constabulary or reported to Dublin Castle, somewhere around 20,000 crimes were reported in Ireland. Fast forward 20 years into 1868, and the number of crimes committed in the country was lower than 2,000. So a significant rise in crime. So landlords took that opportunity to rid themselves of those that they deemed to be of a bad character. And I suppose the fifth reason why landlords engaged in eviction was for the progress of agriculture or agricultural improvement. I think things like drainage was a reason why many landlords chose to remove tenants from their holdings. So the evictions of people during the Great Famine and its aftermath, it left a lasting bitterness. This transfer of land from one to another left a lasting legacy of bitterness. And the reason for that, obviously people had lost their lands, lost their home, but it was also the physical force or the heavy-handed tactics which were used by people. And as we're going to see in the examples that I show in the next few minutes, a lot of the time the evictions and the levelling of houses by crowbar brigades and so on, levellers, hut tumblers as they were known, was carried out by local people. They were employed to do, as they said, the dirty work in actually levelling houses to ensure that people wouldn't return. So this leaves a lasting legacy of bitterness and the reason why the memory of evictions lingers into the future. So the process of eviction, well, I suppose it's very difficult. One of the things when researching evictions during the famine is that you'll quickly realise some landowners went through the courts in order to carry out an eviction, while many simply didn't, and used the upheaval of the 1840s and of the Great Famine period to do effectively as they pleased. And I'm going to touch in a couple of moments on the role of middlemen and eviction. And where we see middlemen evicting tenants, largely it seems they didn't go through the process of the courts. Where they did, the process usually began by distraining cattle, sheep, if they had some, or crops in lieu of rent owed. This was seen as a scare tactic. Where that failed and where people weren't forthcoming with the rent, the action was then taken towards the courts, and where a notice of eviction was posted. And usually a number of months were given. And again, this varies from place to place. You'll see examples where no notice period was given. The eviction was effectively carried out on the spot. But usually a number of months was given before the final eviction process was carried out. You can see on screen there an example from the Strokestown estate of a list of persons in the following townlands who are to be evicted on the 21st, 22nd and 23rd of September 1847, or 1848 it is. And it lists those families which were to be removed and from what townlands the houses were to be levelled. So when we look at the Great Famine of the 1840s and the level of eviction, there are a number of high-profile evictions. And I mentioned Strokestown already, where somewhere in the region of about 2,500 families were evicted. 2,500 people. Kilrush in County Clare is one of the most celebrated evictions carried out by the landowner there, Colonel Vondelor. Ballinrobe in County Mayo, Lord Lucan cleared a whole townland to have a racecourse built. And Toomevara in County Tipperary, the Reverend Massey Dawson's estate, 500 tenants cleared there in a single day. And we're going to return to the incident at Toomevara in a few moments. And another celebrated famine era eviction was that carried out at the Gerard estate in Ballinlass in County Galway. And indeed gave rise to the word Gerardising the tenantry. And if someone was accused of Gerardising the tenantry, it meant effectively that they were threatening or carrying out eviction. And the Gerard evictions is an interesting one because it was one of the earliest large-scale evictions which was carried out. I think about 360 people removed in March of 1846. And it was carried out by Marcella Gerard, one of the few female landowners who actually engaged in this practice during the famine. And you can see the map on the other side of the screen there, which depicts the rates of evictions. And maps like this sometimes tend to be misleading. And I want to show you some maps that I've been working on recently. The map here suggests, or maybe looking at it, that eviction didn't occur in the province of Ulster, didn't occur in great depths on the eastern seaboard. But when we bore down a little bit further, we can see that almost every county, indeed every county on the island of Ireland, was affected in some way or another by evictions. So my own interest in this topic of eviction began, I suppose, more than 12 or 13 years ago when writing my PhD study on land agents, which I spoke to you last year about. And within that study, I began to plot on a map of County Offaly the eviction sites noted, or evictions which were documented. And it's only a fraction of the actual number of evictions. But I think the geography of eviction in that map is interesting. You can see that certain parts of the county were more prone to eviction than others. And of course, that begs questions as to how estates were managed both before, during, and after the famine. I was also curious in the course of writing a history of the Jolie family and their experience of the famine in Kings County, or County Offaly. I was curious about this eviction, which occurred in 1851, in which 57 houses, numbering 700 people, were knocked in the village of Bracknell, in east of County Offaly, in 1851. And although a keen diarist, he kept a diary for over 12 years, both before, during, and after the Great Famine, John Plunkett Jolie makes very little reference to the evictions. All that he notes is on the 20th of June 1851, most of the houses of Bracknell pulled down. Now, there's not a single reference in newspapers of the day to the eviction of 700 people. And this got me thinking, why is there so little reaction generated to the removal of 700 people? In effect, the levelling of an entire village on a single day. It doesn't appear in any newspaper. So this I thought was curious. And I'm also curious in writing about County Offaly during the War of Independence, and in particular in the topic of the burning of country houses. You see on screen here the burning, or a reference to the burning of Kinnity Castle, which has since been rebuilt and is a 4-star hotel. This house was burned in August of 1922, and when it was burned, the perpetrators were heard to say that they were burning it because the children and grandchildren of the evicted tenants are awaiting for their own parliament to restore them to their birthright. And they referenced the evictions of 1852 carried out by its owner, Colonel Thomas Bernard. So I suppose that's where my own interest in evictions came about. And around 2016, I began to look at one particular source and see what that might tell us about evictions. Of course, there's two great sources there's a number of great sources. Parliamentary reports is one, estate collections, estate rentals and so on would be another place to go if you're looking for information on evictions. But the newspapers really are a treasure trove of information on famine era evictions. And so I began to document, where possible, evidence of eviction. So I was particularly interested in the physical location. Was there a physical location given? Was there a landlord cited? Was there the number of evicted tenants listed? And also careful to include the source of information. What was the source that the newspaper was citing, or indeed what was the newspaper source itself? Where tenants' names have been cited, I've recorded those as well, and other relevant information in relation to the eviction, as I'll show you in a couple of minutes. So one of the great things, I suppose, and I'm looking at the people that are tuning in for this talk tonight, spread across the world. I'm probably right in the assertion that many people are interested in genealogy. And of course, this is a remarkable source for genealogy eviction, because a lot of our records in Ireland simply don't go back that far, or indeed you hit a brick wall when researching a family name. And so if they were connected, or if they did emigrate from the country, the chances are they may have been involved in some form of eviction. So it's a great form for genealogical research. So that's what the map looked like in 2016 after several months of research. And that's what it looked like in 2022 with the last input of eviction sites. It now numbers over 1,500 known sites, while there are also 300 to 400, I think about 380 sites that I have been unable to identify the exact location. And what I've done is simply dropped a GPS pin on a location. So for example, if Craigavon was a site of eviction, I simply dropped the pin in the middle of Craigavon. It doesn't relate to the exact field or ditch or turf bank that a tenant might have possessed at some point in the 1840s, but it is as close as it gets at this moment. So as I said, over 1,500 eviction sites that can be clearly identified, and another 380. It shows how the famine impacted the lives of about 25,000 people, and that's a rough estimate. And I think that this is now showing, or now telling us, remarkable new evidence about famine Ireland, and in particular to the process of eviction. And what I mean by this is essentially that we now see for the first time just exactly who the evictors were. Now, the general assumption would have been that the people that carried out evictions were members of the landed gentry, the aristocracy, the absentee landowners who whiled themselves away in London and Dublin and elsewhere while the famine crisis worsened. And yes, it did include the earls and the lords and the sirs. But what I found looking at that sample, and of course it is only a sample, I'm conscious of the fact that it is a small sample, but it's big enough to draw some conclusions. What we're seeing is that it included a whole host of people. So merchants, shopkeepers, doctors, these people were all engaged in eviction. And this class of people, merchants and shopkeepers, and to some extent doctors, in the decade before the Great Famine, had commenced to purchase small tracts of land, generally out on the outlying parts of towns and villages. I suppose investing their newfound wealth in land. And more often than not, these people had very little interaction with tenants who occupied the land, and therefore had very little sympathy for them when the famine hit. The evidence is also suggesting that the evictions were carried out by people of all religious persuasions. And again, some of the general assumptions towards eviction during the famine might have been that it was members of a particular religion or a particular church that carried out the evictions. But this isn't the case. We can see members of all religious persuasions doing so. And we also see other institutions, such as the College of Physicians, holder of significant quantity of land across the country, as was Trinity College. Indeed, Trinity College was the largest landowner in the country at the time of the Great Famine, owning about 195,000 acres of land spread across most of the island of Ireland. And the evictors also include others such as Arthur Guinness, who evicted tenants from a County Wexford property which he possessed. So there is some problems and challenges with the research. As I mentioned, townland names are often unidentifiable or have changed. Tenants were often readmitted, so this poses a problem. Tenants could be evicted one day and readmitted the next. So technically, were they evicted or were they not? There's local newspaper bias when researching the topic, and this is interesting, and I suppose a little tip for researchers out there. If you hit a blank wall with carrying out research on famine era evictions, it might be worth searching in neighbouring county newspapers. So I'll give an example. If evictions were carried out in County Offaly, perhaps look at County Laois or Kildare or Westmeath or Tipperary, because sometimes newspaper editors were reluctant to publish information about evictions because it was painting landowners in a bad light. And the other problem or challenge I suppose the research has encountered is towards the end of the Great Famine, eviction becomes a daily norm, and some newspapers begin to drop off on their coverage of what is actually occurring. But I'm going to touch on one newspaper proprietor in particular in a couple of moments. So when looking at certain parts of the country, some were more notorious than other when it came to the process of eviction. And Tipperary, I think, is a county which sets itself apart. Even before the famine commenced, Tipperary was often referred to simply as Bloody Tipperary. And there are a number of reasons why evictions are quite notable in Tipperary. Firstly, the military presence of the British military in a number of garrisons in County Tipperary towns aided the eviction process in that county. And it's curious when you look at the reporting on evictions in Tipperary, the military are quite often cited as being present at the eviction. The cruelty of the Crowbar Brigade in Tipperary sets them apart. And we're going to go on to the case of Toomevara, and I'll mention that in a few moments. It just seems that eviction was an ever-present threat. It was constant in Tipperary, as was the reporting of the event, and as was the response by the community. And the frequency of murder and attempted murder following evictions in Tipperary sets it apart as well.
Ciarán, what is the Crowbar
Yeah.
Brigade? That obviously that was kind of a nickname they were given, but
Yeah, crowbars, effectively the crowbar, these people that carried out the levelling of houses, they were often referred to in the records as crowbar because they used crowbars to pull down the houses, cabins and so on. They're referred to as hut tumblers and others, levelers, or just simply as wreckers. Quite often you'll see a reference, wreckers, and that's what that refers to.
and I suppose hut tumbler is probably quite appropriate considering the standard of housing in many cases was
absolutely.
extremely poor. It was
Extremely,
literally just a hut that was probably very easily knocked down. No, thank you very much.
Yeah, you'll see that in a couple of moments when I get it. So, some other notable findings, I suppose, from the research is it's allowing us to reevaluate, I should say, previous research, and in my own case, returning to the Mahon evictions. Now, when I plotted the evictions on the Mahon estate in 1847 and 1848, I seen something remarkable on screen that isn't apparent from other sources, and that was that the majority of evictions which occurred in 1847 and 48 actually occurred along the passage from the village of Ciarán Barry, 2 strokes down. And in 1847-48, the Mahon family were trying their utmost to have the railway brought from Ciarán Barry, from Longford, I should say, 2 strokes down. So it does suggest that these people were cleared in preparation for the coming of the railway, which never actually materialised. The research findings as well provide insights into remarkable stories and in many cases horrendous stories, such as that of Biddy McLaughlin at Buncrana in Donegal. Now, Biddy McLaughlin was 14 years of age when she was brought before Buncrana Petty Sessions in July 1849 for trying to prevent the levelling of her house. Her mother had gone to nearby Derry, it is said during the course of the court case, and Biddy was left on her own to defend the house. And what brought her or landed her before the courts was the fact that she struck one of the hut tumblers or levellers. And the evidence that was presented to the Petty Sessions and reported in the Freeman's Journal in 1849 tells us that the hut tumblers included cousins of Biddy McLaughlin, first cousins, which just shows us, tells us a little bit more about the horrors of what actually occurred. The evidence also suggests that there were people like James Cuff, who I titled the Mayo Evictor, who carried out the eviction of 64 families consisting of 350 individuals at Ballinrobe in County Mayo, all listed there on screen. Now, Cuff is an interesting character. He was a member of the Repeal Party, a supporter of Daniel O'Connell. The Repeal Party, Daniel O'Connell and Cuff himself were outspoken critics of landowners and those who engaged in the process of eviction before the famine. But Cuff, it seems, had fallen on personal hard times by 1848-49 and had decided to engage in the process of eviction himself. So this is somebody who had previously been against such a practice. The evidence suggests that whole townlands were cleared, and not just cleared, but disappeared from the map. This is an example here which was brought to my attention during the course of the research by a man called Jody Moylan. And Jody highlighted the fact that the whole townland of Drimna in County Roscommon disappeared as a result of clearances during the Great Famine. And what you're looking at there on screen, I don't know if you can make it out, but you can see an Ordnance Survey map from 1838, which highlights that settlement, a number of houses, and the picture on the opposite side is the townland of Drimna today. There's empty fields, overgrown, which once was a teeming population of people. And this is repeated in other parts of the country as well. For example, at Lisgoban in County Roscommon, 32 families were levelled, the houses of 32 families were levelled in one day and erased, as the newspaper report said, from their foundations, and 130 human beings thrown both to the world's wide waste. And what you can see on screen below the newspaper report is the townland of Lisgoban today, where once stood 32 houses, there is just one farmhouse today. And the other evidence of eviction, and I suppose it bears back to Dolores' question there a few moments ago, just how quickly evictions could take place and just the quality of housing which actually people lived in. So we see examples from Clondougan, County Meath, for example, in 1848. It only took a few hours to level 17 houses and clear a whole townland. In Doonbeg, County Clare, not a stone upon a stone was left after the razing of 40 houses in September 1849. At Drimna, as I mentioned, 210 people removed in one day from the Barton estate. And during the course of eviction from the Beamish estate, and note the word Beamish estate, 95 people were removed, and it was claimed that one poor woman was, quote, being buried to death amongst the ruins from which she had not the strength to drag her weakened limbs. And likewise at Lord Clonmel's estate in Tipperary, it was claimed that nothing could be more distressing than to hear the clanking of the crowbars, demolishing the cabins which were mingled with the most pitiful and heartrending shrieks of women and of children. And there were some who engaged in eviction more vehemently than others. Marcus Keane in County Clare and his bunch of wreckers were particularly noted. Marcus Keane, it was said, and I think I might have mentioned him last year in the course of talking about agents, it was said, so reviled was he that when he died, the rats infested his grave. He was responsible for the evictions of thousands of people in County Clare on the Vandeleur and other estates. And you can see there, he has, we are told, a troop of 20 of them engaged for a 2 days demolition. So in this town of Reilly, 11 houses were tumbled by 20 men over the course of 2 days. And you can see there more evidence of extermination in County Clare. And that's what my data set looks like. Just when I look at the County of Clare, for example, you can see the GPS location, the townland, the landowner, the number evicted, and the source. I mentioned earlier that there was a problem with middlemen, and I jump back to that screen there. So that's just, I suppose, a very simple hierarchy of the land structure in Ireland in the 1840s. And I would have talked at length in last year's lecture about this. But as the squeeze was placed on middlemen to bring in rents by landowners during the famine, it was very often middlemen who engaged in some of this particular nasty eviction and the levelling of houses. We can see here an example. At this moment, Mr. Tidd, the under-sheriff, is busily at work in the townland of Dromora West, this is in County Clare, and evicting 52 families and probably more. And this was being carried out by a middleman who had fallen into arrears. And just more examples from County Clare of those middlemen evicting in large numbers. One of the reasons we know so much about the evictions during the famine period is largely thanks to this man mentioned here on screen, James McCarthy, who was proprietor of the Limerick and Clare Examiner. And he was prolific in accounting for eviction in the west of Ireland. He was prolific actually in visiting the sites of eviction. And if you look and try to chart the places that he visited, or at least that the newspaper reported on, he must have had a number of correspondents out in the field. And very often newspapers across the country would simply copy the news that McCarthy reported in his Limerick and Clare Examiner. So for a start, when looking at evictions, the Limerick and Clare Examiner is probably one of the best sources to head to. McCarthy was relentless. As he said himself, it was a pilgrimage that he undertook amid scenes of havoc and despair. And he didn't let landlords off the hook for what they were actually carrying out. Of one visit to an eviction site in County Clare, he wrote that he had seen the gaunt and miserable being hunted there as wolves by the bloodhounds of the unchristian, that diabolical system which has turned many into desert wastes and howling wilderness. So pretty graphic description of what the countryside was like. McCarthy wasn't alone in condemning evictions, and even some of the landed class themselves recalled the horrors of famine-era evictions. This man here, William Butler, later decorated officer in the British Army, he later wrote of his memories of the famine. He said, "It was a scene I have never forgotten. I was but 12 years old at the time, but I think that if a loaded gun had been placed in my hands, I would have fired into that crowd of villains as they plied their horrible trade." I'm going to jump on. I know I'm pushing on time now, but again, referring back to Tipperary as an example, I mentioned that Tipperary was noted as bloody Tipperary. It was said of Tipperary that they resorted to enacting vengeance on those who had carried out evictions far greater than indeed any other county did. And some parts of the country were remarkably quiet where evictions were carried out. For example, in County Meath, there was large-scale evictions carried out in a number of towns and villages, but the people, it seems, remained relatively calm compared to Tipperary, where they resorted to violence in the aftermath of eviction. And I have lots more examples there that I could go through, but just to share an example of another individual. This was a land agent, George Garvey. I think I mentioned him last year. He survived 7 assassination attempts throughout the course of the famine. He was employed in counties Tipperary and Offaly. It seems, I think he He escaped assassination for at least one assassination attempt for every estate that he managed. And evictions continued to occur as the famine continued. Even on the day that Queen Victoria visited Ireland in August 1849, when there was great rejoicings in Dublin and so on, the Tipperary Vindicator reported in this neighbourhood, on the very day that the Queen was visiting Dublin, John Flanagan of Neenah, accompanied by the sub-sheriff, untenanted 45 houses and razed the remnants to the grounds. And the newspaper, of course, draws the comparisons there of rejoicings in Dublin and eviction in Tipperary. And I'll skip on there. It is said that even though the military were present, they were not often as heartless as some of the hut tumblers and wreckers. And of one eviction in Tipperary, it was said that even the soldiers shed tears. I've mentioned Tumavara on a number of occasions, and it's a celebrated eviction on the Reverend Massey Dawson's estate. In this instance, it's said that local people were employed to carry out the removal of nearly 600 people and the levelling of houses. The newspapers report that the evictors, the hut tumblers, were plied with drink, filled with whiskey before actually engaging in the process of eviction. And it's a widely documented eviction site. So I focused, and I suppose to conclude, what of the north of the country? You'll have noticed in the map that I showed earlier that large portions of Ulster were affected by eviction, as was the east of the country. Indeed, it's curious when we look at the impact of the famine in different parts of the country. Why, for example, does County Carlow have the highest level of evictions in 1849 and 1850? You know, it's not a county that is as badly affected as other parts of the country. But to Ulster, more work is required. And one of the things that sets the province of Ulster apart is that while evictions did occur, they didn't seem to occur in the huge numbers that they did in the west and south of the country. And I'm sure Jared will have some examples from County Armagh and elsewhere, maybe to share with us in a few moments. So we see some examples there from 1849. William Mago Bond removing 30 people in Armagh, Lord O'Neill 40 people in Antrim, Lord Downshire 43 people at Banbridge, and the Duke of Abercorn and Strabane 28 people. This is significantly smaller than the 600 people, for example, in the Reverend Massey Dawson's estate. So they don't generate the same level of outrage or reportage that the evictions in the south do. By 1849, it was claimed that over 2,200 families had been evicted in the province of Ulster, with Armagh leading the way with 475 evictions. That 475 people evicted, not 475 different evictions. So I'd be interested to hear what Jared has come across in that respect. It was said of this high level of eviction in counties such as Armagh that it prompted the Nation newspaper to exclaim, "How comes it to pass that in independent Ulster, the only part of Ireland where tenant right exists, the number of evictions is nearly equal to those in Connacht and much greater than those of Leinster?" I think that's a slight exaggeration. The men of the north should look to this in time, but I think it was a clarion call for landowners that they should not engage in this practice in the north. So to conclude, and I see a lot of questions coming in there on the chat. I'm happy to answer question. This research into the evictions of the Great Famine period has shown that the evictors came from a wide social background. No areas of the country were exempt from eviction. And it shows that certain parts of the country, as I've mentioned, like Carlow, Kilkenny and Wexford, had curiously high numbers of evictions when compared with the impact of the famine in those places. There's more work to be done, and I'm conscious of the fact that it is a small sample, but I think it's enough for the time being to draw some conclusions, and I suppose to generate some interest and discussion in the topic. So with that, I leave it there and take your questions.
Thank you very much, Ciarán. I just want to ask, you're just going to stop sharing, Ciarán? Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you. So I'm just looking at some of the questions here. Actually, Perry, who actually is one of our guest speakers next week,
McIntyre,
she
yeah.
mentioned here, how in Australian newspapers reported on convictions, but of course, the information was often copied from newspapers in the UK and Ireland.
But that's interesting though, and thanks to Perry for highlighting that, because sometimes those newspapers that the Australian newspapers report are gone or missing. So it might be the only time that the evidence survives. I wouldn't discount it. I think it's a great source to go to. And I presume she's talking about Trove, the Australian newspaper site.
I know speakers in previous lectures have mentioned how, when it comes to regional newspapers, it was very much on a political level, whether, as you say, information around the likes of evictions, etc., of this time were actually put into local press. That was, I think, Michelle McGuff-McCann mentioned that in relation to County Monaghan and Northern
Right.
Standard and its kind of political allegiances, that
Yeah.
what information was available, or in many ways, so little information was made available.
Yeah.
We're wondering, William, is McGo Bond, is that in relation, would they be the same family that owned Ardress House? I presume so.
I'll
I
I
presume
The
so.
Artery.
I
It would have been the
I
Artery,
passed
not
the
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 Jared
Artery.
Ardress,
there.
oh, the Ardrey, thank you, George.
Yeah.
The
Um,
Artery, yeah. I thought, yeah.
um, where where would I look for information on evictions in Monaghan? Again, this is a problem. Very little information would have been put in the likes of the Northern Standard. But if you looked at probably more press within other areas, like the Armagh-based newspapers or the likes of the Anglo-Celt, you might get actually information. Or some of the Fermanagh papers might
Yeah,
have some information on Monaghan too.
I think so. Yeah, it depends what part of Monaghan you're looking for.
Yeah.
Obviously, the surrounding papers. I think a good go to, and Monaghan is well circumstanced with landed estate papers, but estate rentals are probably the best. They're a great source for evictions because there's annotations beside tenants' names and so on, and you can trace them. I should have said that I began this in 2016 and it was kind of a sideline. And it was only when COVID hit and you're sitting there scratching and you're wondering, well, I can't access anything, but I can access online newspapers. So this was very much a COVID project, which kind of deep dived into newspapers. I would say, to bring the project a little bit further, I'd have to look at estate rentals in greater detail. So for whatever part of the country, if it's Monaghan, wherever you're looking at, have a look and see if there's estate rentals surviving.
There's also, and it's almost, they're made like throwaway comments, but in the Relief Commission papers, when people are applying for and and it's interesting actually to compare the same writer who's making an application to a British government agency, and the same writer then writing to, for example, the Society of Friends, and they're much more open in the latter. And they're not afraid to say that in this area, and as I said, it's just a throwaway comment, that so many people have been evicted. Now, it's a needle in a haystack, but one of the things that it's almost like a leitmotif in all that correspondence is the reference constantly to lack of resident gentry. That this idea that the areas are just decimated, they've been left to the likes of the agents, and they lament the fact that there are no resident gentry. And that's slightly going off the topic, Ciarán, I appreciate that, but you'll find that the vast majority of cases, the people writing, certainly in Ulster, where I'm looking at, would be members of the Episcopalian Church, Church of Ireland, and they're saying, I'm the only landlord in the area. There are a couple of smaller gentry, and that's it. And the major landholders are absentee, and that's one thing that shouts out.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. And that's an interesting source. Now, I suppose in the relief, those petitions for help and so on, yeah, they would contain huge amount of information.
Yeah, very much so.
Very good, Jared. Yeah.
The thing is, as well, you could talk about the eviction of people, but the system in some ways also evicted people that you couldn't get relief during the famine unless you gave up the holding resources you had access to.
Yeah.
So the system was another way of forcing people out.
Well, it's actually interesting, Dolores, that Ciarán mentioned the quarter acre clause, the Gregory clause. And I came across stuff when I was researching County Leitrim, where one of the British government appointed inspectors, Captain Edmund Wynne, said that people had just been left homeless, houseless, as he said. Hundreds and hundreds throughout the country were just lying in ditches, trying to survive. And he made reference to the fact that in some cases, their neighbours had taken advantage of them. And he said, often at a trifling cost. So human nature, like Ciarán was talking about how locals and cousins were going around knocking down houses. And we tend to, I think, when we look at lists and lists of people and we look at the names, we sort of look at it as an aggregate and think, isn't it awful? Actually, within those lists, there are people that you would have been very friendly with. There are people that you couldn't stand. There are people who would have been devious, sneaky, blah, blah, blah. The same as we have today. And it's no surprise to find that somebody up the road who's had a grievance against your family for a couple of generations maybe was only too delighted to knock your house down, or to take your land from you. Do you know what I mean? And say, cheerio, good luck in America or Australia. That's human nature. And I think it's one of the things that jumps out when you're and actually, just off, you were saying there, Ciarán, about Kennedy, 80 years later. Less than 70 years later, I was interviewing a woman in Lurgan. I was writing a book on the Clan Gael, common law class scale. And I was just interviewing this woman, and her husband was involved in the 56 campaign.
Right.
And she said, and this would have been 2022 or so, and she said, I remember Christmas Eve 56 like it was yesterday. The specials came to my door, and she went on to describe in great detail what happened. And I was thinking, that's 70 years ago. So it's nothing in terms of, so those sons, grandsons, going and burning Kennedy Castle, it's 70 years is nothing in terms of history and memory.
It's family folklore. It's family folklore going down through the family lines it's such a big impact.
That's it.
On family members.
Yeah, right. And it's more than just folklore, because
folklore. Apologies.
No, but I know what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing, but people can sit. If you get somebody who's lucid in their 80s or 90s, they can just relate information from 70, 80 years ago like it was today. It's amazing.
And especially when emotions are involved, that trauma. Is very much engraved without it, very much so.
The first point that you were making there, Jared, about the people turning on each other. I mentioned earlier that I'm in the middle of writing a book, and that's the major theme of the book is looking at how people interact with each other. And look, it's not popular sometimes to write that and say it and put it down on paper, but it's reality, and it needs to be told, I think.
And
sorry.
In any times of crisis anywhere, there are always some people who will financially benefit or grab the opportunity to financially benefit. This is human nature we're dealing with, and the variety of different personalities.
Well, you see people who will actually gladly buy a house that's been repossessed. Other people wouldn't touch it. They think it'll be bad luck will go with it, etc. But there are people who will buy repossessed houses at a knockdown price to this day. So it's human nature.
That's it, yeah.
Has anybody found much information in the schools collection giving details in relation to evictions?
I looked before now. Obviously, I haven't done a systematic look at it now, but what I found was it was vague references, maybe a reflection of the children being interviewed as opposed to maybe adults. But yeah, it's definitely worth a look there to see. You've probably used that, have you, Jared?
I've had a quick look at it, and again, I remember looking at the schools collection for County Leitrim, and even though it was only 67 years ago, I almost contradict myself. You tend to find that people got mixed up with some of the stories, and some of the stories would relate then to 1798. Which would have been big in Leitrim because of Ballinammuck and the Longford border. I found a lot of the schools collection, there was a huge amount of riddles in it. It was as if people passed their time doing riddles, if I could ask just a couple of things, Ciarán, you mentioned the elections. Yeah. And I remember looking at the 1826 election for County Armagh, which was so overshadowed by the Clare election. But it was of huge importance because you had two members returned for Armagh who were both pro-Celtic emancipation. And but I remember, and Dolores was asking about the elections could take a week, where the tenants marched in behind the banners of the various landlords, and the landlords knew the way that they were going to vote. And I'm just wondering, you referenced the British general elections. did it apply to the poor law elections? Now, I know the poor law elections, they were ostensibly elected. In most cases, it was just a matter of turning up, and your peers basically rubber stamped you. But I looked at the 1852 poor law elections in County Leitrim, and there was fierce rivalry there, and competition to get basically the priests or the church's candidates onto the Board of Guardians. So, how did you find that in relation to the poor law elections?
Yeah, they're not, I suppose, they're not as well reported, the poor law elections in certain parts of the country, but they're hotly contested. You have the priests agitating, as you say, to get people elected. There's reports of fist fights being breaking out on election day. But yeah, it would have occurred in much similar fashion as did the general election. I don't think the public interest was as wide, though, when it came to
Yeah,
the poor law elections.
yeah,
I suppose a bit like today, how many people go and vote in a European referendum?
yeah,
You turn out for the local elections, you will, or the general election, but European referendum is only if you're engaged in the topic or whatever, you'll actually go to vote. So, I get the sense that there wasn't as much engagement on the poor law elections, but yeah, certainly as you found in Leitrim, there was a lot of agitation around election day.
And I was just wondering,
Sure.
Ciarán, I mean, sorry, Dolores, I was just wondering, Ciarán, if
Sure.
you just, I mean, I've come across material for South Derry, in around Maherfelt, Moneymore. And I'm just wondering, could it be argued that assisted immigration was actually a proxy for eviction? That you had the London companies, and they're receiving these letters from tenants all over those estates, and the tenants are basically saying, listen, I was in good position 6-7 years ago. This is 1852, 53, and I've lost everything. My brother's in America, blah, blah, blah. And you just find there's a stream of these letters for the South Derry area. And I'm just wondering, could that be argued that it was seen as so they weren't down as evicted tenants, but the land was cleared, and the estate holders were only too happy to see them cleared?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Like it's eviction. It can be argued it's eviction by another name. There certainly were some landowners who engaged in the process of assisted immigration as a means of being benevolent, but there were others that simply wished to clear their lands.
Yeah,
Like the expert on the assisted immigrations, of course, is Jared Moore, and Jerry's
yeah,
written widely on sending out Ireland's poor. But
yes,
like if you look at a character like Francis Spate in County Clare, like he was chartered ships to carry timber from Canada, and the ships would come with laden with material, and then they were being sent back empty. So he
yeah,
cashed in on that
yeah.
on the double. So yeah, no, in many cases it's simply eviction by another name. But I suppose we just have to break down all of these assisted immigration schemes. I think Jerry Moran arrives at a figure of about 100,000 people were assisted in passage during the famine. So, like he's written widely on the Palmerstown estate and others.
Yes.
But there probably is still a lot of work to be done in that.
What about the tenant right? Did you find? I have found that has played little or no part when it came to evictions in Ulster.
Yeah, and I think that's the point that I'm making in that last quotation there, that the writer in the Nation is saying that tenant right exists in Ulster. Yeah, it's curious. To be honest with you, I simply haven't looked at Ulster in as much detail as other parts
Well,
of the
sure,
country.
sure, yeah. No, just because it's often thrown up about tenant right, and it just doesn't seem to play a part. It just doesn't,
Sure. Can you explain tenant right, please?
Tenant right was basically where if a tenant had made, basically had improved the property, then upon the sale they received recompense for the improvements it made to the property. It was basically a security of tenure, so they couldn't be theoretically they couldn't be just evicted. That they had security of tenure, and they were safe in their holding. But I have found that it didn't seem to play it didn't seem to play a part when it came to evictions. They evicted. They mentioned Armagh. One of the problems with Armagh, I covered this in my thesis, and I remember talking to a barrister about it because it is very complex when you're dealing with eviction. The eviction process was the length of time it took and how intricate it was, and then, as Ciarán alluded to there, you had readmissions. So you actually had people who were officially evicted, and then you had readmissions, and it's trying to work through that detail. It's very, very complex.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
What are your thoughts on someone has suggested here that assisted immigration was eviction by another name?
Yeah, we say
Yeah,
that.
I think just
That, but also assisted immigration, it wasn't only eviction, but it was also trying to reduce pressure and potentially people also then entering the workhouse, which was another cost on the local landlord.
absolutely, yeah,
You know,
that's why I say there's a lots of nuances, and we just have to break down individual
I- in
states a little bit further.
I
in
mean, the
relate,
Derry workhouse was from day one. The Derry workhouse stands out in Ulster as they were very, very keen to pay passage to British North America, Canada. Very keen from 1842, 43. And they were sending out 30, 40 people a year. And then, of course, the more you sent out, then the more connection it was. So then there was that sort of, sibling immigration and you would find where they'll say, the husband's gone and the wife and children want to go, etc. And so the Derry workhouse stands out as one that it was really, and of course that then reduced the potential for people going into the workhouse and then the poor rates.
Yeah. I see a comment there from Perry, which of course is very true. Of course, the old adage, I read it in the newspaper, so it must be true, must be kept in mind. She's 100% right.
Yes, but then again, they're one of the major sources.
Yeah.
So like, for example, if you're looking at Newry, you've got the Newry Telegraph, which is a pro-establishment, and the Newry Examiner, which would be an O'Connellite paper. So you can sort of make inferences from reading the two contrasting perspectives. Sometimes you'll see the same report of a Board of Guardians meeting or a meeting of the Extraordinary Presentment Sessions, late 1846, and the two newspaper reports are completely different. So you've got to be circumspect, but at the same time, when you are looking at limited sources, newspapers are very, very valuable. Even from the point of view of adverts, you see, looking at Belfast in 1845, you're trying to think, right, when does it actually start in Belfast? Well, in late 1845, some bakers are announcing the introduction of a new, cheaper loaf, which suggests that it's already hitting then in late 1845,
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you about resistance to eviction. I mean, I came across one in the markets area of Belfast, which would be, if anybody knows Belfast, be around about Central Station and the southeast Belfast. And there was an attempt there to evict families in a street in 1851. And the people came out and stopped the eviction. The furniture had been removed, etc. And the police were beaten up. And of course, it was Belfast, but the eviction didn't go ahead.
Yeah.
in relation to Ulster, first of all, some people have asked your map with the pins where you've pinpointed. Is that map available, or I'm presuming maybe that's part of your research that'll be more openly available in your next book?
Yeah, it will be, certainly it'll feature in the book, but it was online. It's down at the moment, and I hope to get it back up. The idea behind it was that it would be a resource for everybody to use free of charge, and that people could gain information from it. It is down at the moment, but I hope to get it back up soon.
In relation to evictions too, if people were evicted, that doesn't mean then they automatically emigrated, because you need to have some financial resource, access to financial resource to emigrate, and many were too poor as well. In relation to Ulster, and there seems to be a gap in relation to potential information, there weren't as many evictions. Ger, do you want to touch on that? Is there any specific reason, maybe to industry at the time or anything like that as well in Ulster?
Well,
I don't know. I'm just wondering. There could be just other avenues to explore.
I mean, you will find Board of Guardians who will say, we've had an influx of paupers because of evictions in the area. Again, they make references to it. But when you look at, for example, the linen area of Lisburn, Lurgan, Banbridge, Armagh, the worst of it was over by 49. Whereas as you move west into Tyrone and around the Omagh area, and then you're going into Donegal and down into Fermanagh, it continues until arguably until 1853, 1854. So again, it's one of those, you can't look at Ulster as just because it's a province as, there were a series of Ulsters. There was East. I mean, the part of the area that was hit immediately in 1845 was North Antrim, which would be seen as really staunch Protestant territory, and yet they were really badly hit. They were the first area to be hit in the province in 1845. But by the time it comes to 1848-49, it's past there. But the further south you go, as I say, in the Monaghan, Cavan, Fermanagh, and over west into Donegal, it's still there, it pertains until 1853-54. But there are so many anomalies. I've looked at the decline by townland for every townland in Ulster, and you find that the county which suffered the least number of townland decreases, so in other words, the number of townlands that lost population, the county that saw the least number of those was Donegal. So I mean, that's again, it's only by doing that sort of, you're looking at you're always trying, as a researcher, and Ciarán knows, as a researcher, you're always trying to basically talk to the people who were there. You're trying to get the research to the nth degree. You can say what actually happened on the ground, and there are a number of anomalies, and you'll see it all the time where neighbouring townlands, one townland was wiped out, and another townland was hardly affected.
Yeah.
During the famine period, when it comes to evictions, proportionately, is there any kind of knowledge on maybe the amount of evictions where the property was left standing and maybe new tenants put in? Because I know the narrative is, yes, a lot of homes / huts were levelled, especially when it came to per standard of housing.
Yeah,
it was very easy to level them.
There's simply not that level of detail available. And I see a comment there, just looking back on some of the questions and comments there, like Dave Farrell makes a very good point there. He says about the the people that give up their holdings to enter the workhouse, had they any right to recourse when they come out of the workhouse if the house had been levelled? I was getting to this point. We don't know. We just simply don't know where houses levelled were they readmitted or whatever when they came back out. The constabulary only start to, the police only start to keep records of eviction from 1849 onwards. So prior to 1849, so that detail that you're asking about, Dolores, houses levelled as opposed to houses left standing, yes, it might survive from 1849 onwards, but we have a period from 45 to 49 where we simply don't know. It's only in estate papers where the landlord is actually recording, and not just in rentals. You sometimes have a look as well if you're looking for eviction statistics or eviction information. Have a look at account books, because the landlords are actually recording paying these men. Paid Pat Murphy 10 shillings for levelling 6 houses on such a date. So there's information to be got there, but by and large, that the information that you're asking wouldn't survive.
But mind you, when you read through the likes of the outrage papers, I mean, woe betide the man who took the house of an evicted tenant.
Yeah.
Very much so, and they were saying that they would have been treated like informers, basically, so they were just shunned. And if they were lucky and they were attacked and maybe their property was attacked, their cattle was attacked. So taking the house of an evicted tenant was something that was either very brave or very foolhardy.
Yeah.
And in the case, yes, most of the population were living in rural environment at the time, but for those who were living in a town city setting, circumstances would have been different. It wouldn't have been a case of, levelling a hut or a house, but there would have been evictions made if people couldn't pay rent, if they'd no work in any kind of industry. Or is there much information on that during the period? Because I know with the famine, we have a tendency to think of the more rural Ireland, but the famine did impact those living in cities as well, in large towns.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And again, probably a lot of the research has kind of drifted towards the western side of the country and the south and whatnot. Like 2 years ago there, I co-edited a collection of essays on the famine in Dublin, which surprisingly, up until 2022, nobody had looked at in great detail. So, for example, I'd love to see a book of essays on how the famine impacted Belfast. And I know there was one, Christine, and I think, Jared, you were involved with that previously.
Well, no, I co-authored it with Christine,
Christine.
the famine in Belfast, yeah.
But wouldn't it be great to get 10 or 12 people writing on different topics and looking at how the famine impacted Belfast in a dozen different ways, and the same for the other centres across the country as well, and towns. But you're right, Dolores. Yeah, the famine does impact in terms of industry and the knock-on effect that the failure of the potato has. And of course, Ireland's going into decline prior to the famine as well. Like the levels of poverty prior to the Great Famine are staggering in town and village.
Secure what you're saying, and this just relates to the mid-90s, and I always thought a great opportunity was lost when the Irish Famine Network was set up, because they funded 8 research papers, and you know this, which never saw the light of day. I've read some of them. They're highly statistical. They wouldn't relate to the ordinary person in the street. They're very, and they were kept undercover, and they picked out 2 poor law unions from each province. And in Ulster, for example, they did one, and I think it was Donegal and one from Anna, and they never got into the heart of it. And I remember being in Dublin Castle in '97 and asking why, and the glib answer given, well, sure, somebody could ask in Tipperary, why are you doing it in Kerry? Of course, I never got a chance to reply, well, nobody in Tipperary or Kerry's denying it actually took place, and that was the big thing in Ulster. But I always thought that if you could have, with the money that was available then, if you could have given, for example, 1,000, it would have been punts then, to a researcher and said, come back in 3 years' time with an in-depth research paper on your poor law union, each of the 130. Just think of the body of work we would have had then.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So, like when I was saying about the markets area in Bev, I'm looking at a very small local history in the markets. I've been asked to do that, and again, that's where you're micro studying, because you're looking at the ads, because there isn't an awful lot there, so you're having to use whatever is. So I agree with what you say. You mean, if Christine and myself wrote that, but if you're looking at people who are maybe looking at the geography of it, or the psychology of it, or maybe just evictions or the legal, whatever it is, then you get a much broader picture.
Absolutely, yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
In relation to estate records, I suppose a lot of records probably have been lost over the years as estates have been kind of broken up and sold and et cetera, et cetera. So that's probably just a national thing where paperwork is kind of discarded, destroyed, and I'm sure, like in some
it is
areas,
and it isn't, I suppose. Yeah, like you can be lucky for whatever part of the country you're researching. You can be lucky, you can be unlucky, but there's the thing about the famine in particular is there's more and more material becoming available all the time. It's endless, the amount of material that is just simply becoming available. Like we had a donation in Maynooth a few years ago of a fantastic estate archive from County Cavan, and like the details that provides on the Great Famine is staggering. So you can be lucky.
Is it literally a case that some stuff is sitting in people's attics and then somebody passes on or something, and then you found? Is that really kind of the stuff that's actually happening?
I think sometimes people forget what's there, or maybe somebody within a family might be interested in papers or in the stories. Somebody else may not be. There might have been a researcher or somebody locally interested in them 20 years ago, and they're taken out then but forgotten about. But no, I think you just have to look. And I see the question there, in your experience with families, are they unwilling to share? I would say no. Families, if your intentions are right, what you're looking for, you're not looking to steal anything, you're looking to research the papers in a genuine way, I think, and you go about it in the right manner, I think people will engage with you.
The Irish Famine Network papers, were they kept quiet, or could that maybe be expanded a little bit? The Irish Famine Network, when was that established?
I'll throw that to Jared, because
Jared, for those of us who have no knowledge, just a little bit of background.
Established in 1993, 94. They brought out a couple of publications.
Sorry, can I ask who established the Irish Famine Network?
Trinity College. I think it was largely Trinity. I know it was funded by the Dublin government, and they produced 2 books for public use. One was, I think it was Estate Records for the Great Irish Famine, and the other one was Sources for the Great Irish Famine. And then they commissioned these 8 studies of poor law unions by historians of the time, and I've seen a couple of them. One was done from Ballina, one was done for Enniskillen. They may be available online, but they were never made public, as in published or anything like that. And they're just,
it's a shame.
Well, it's a shame, but they would provide a good basis for somebody doing research in that area. Do you know what I mean? So if you're looking, if you want to find out more about a particular workhouse, they're a good basis, but it's very, very statistical. So there's great analysis there in terms of the stats, but I think, if you've got admission registers and the minute books, I mean, you can add so much more to it. But yeah, it was kept very much. Maybe Ciarán disagrees, but I think it was just kept very much amongst the academic fraternity, and they never really saw the light of day. Which is a pity.
Well, to be honest, I don't know much about them at all, and I have looked at one online. I think there's definitely one I've seen online for Borough Workhouse in County. But I don't know about the ins and outs, and you know more than me on it. But it is a great shame. But I do think with the commemorations in the 1990s and with the research that was being carried out, there was a mad rush, 93, 94, 95 into 96. And then it stopped because we were heading for the bicentenary of 1798. The peace process was commencing in the north. And there was this rush to talk about 1798.
That's right.
The famine wasn't over because the famine goes on into the early 1850s. So that commemoration kind of cut short. And perhaps, as I said, I don't know the background to those papers, but perhaps they were lost in that rush to do other research,
Well, I think the irony was that the British government said the famine was over in 48, 49, and researchers, by their work, actually tied in with that because the vast majority of material that was produced at the time, and again, up until Christine Keneally's groundbreaking book in 1994, This Great Calamity, there was virtually nothing written on the subject, and certainly very, very little at the local level. They died by inches. I remember there was one in I think it was about either Scull or Skibbereen in County Cork. It was a great book, but very, very, very little material produced. And what researchers did, they used the British Relief Commission papers, which terminate in June, July 1847. Why? Because then the British then said, right, okay, now all relief falls under the Poor Law Extension Act. And all those books then told the same line, and you had really great information from, say, July, August 46 through to May 47, say, the Soup Kitchen Act, etc. And then it just became very dry. Whereas, if you look at one source, for example, the Society of Friends papers, which is easily as important as Relief Commission papers, it's a vast archive, has not been mined. And they go into the 1850s because the Society of Friends realised, well, this isn't over. So they were giving out food, they were giving out clothes. I have lists of people in Loughgall, where the Orange Order was founded in 1795, names of people who were receiving food and clothing into 1848-49. And then you find, for example, in Lough Neagh, and we're just south of Lough Neagh, that the Society of Friends were giving money to fishermen to build boats for eel fishing or pollen fishing. And pollens in this part of the word, Pollan, pollen fishing is very, very popular. So that archive has never been used because, as you say, the big work was get it done for 95, the sesquicentenary, and then we look at the bicentenary of 98. Then it was the Act of Union, and everything was all about book sales because if you can get a book out when there's a centenary of some sort or a celebration, then you're going to sell a lot more copies.
Absolutely, yeah.
I know we'll have to finish shortly. Just quickly, can I ask if people want to research what were the kind of the local newspapers of the time, it really just probably is a matter of just going into Google and searching, asking for search regional papers, let's say during time period.
The newspaper archive, you got the newspaper archive, Irish newspapers, newspaper archive.
Sorry, Jared, just clear that that's the British newspaper archive. You've
got the Irish newspaper archive, you got the British newspaper archive, and they have, and it's much cheaper, and it's fantastic because it's just it's by county. And you can go into that and you can word search, so you can actually type in Townlands, 1846, 78, whatever, and you will find there's a wealth of information. And that's being added to all the time.
So the Irish newspaper archive, and then there's also separately the British newspaper archive. Just because I know, Jared, people could have difficulty reading the subtitles in the YouTube recording, and we have to make sure. Sorry,
thanks for that, Dolores. Thank you.
Sorry, I had to get it. Sorry, Ciarán, you were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say there's also a hard copy book. I'm just trying to remember the exact title, but it's an index of British and Irish newspapers, periodicals. You'll find it in most county libraries. And it's basically a listing of all newspapers that existed in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. As someone saying, news plan there is it called news plan? Or no, news plan is another one. I think.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think, is there anything else there, Ciarán, before we finish up? Or
No,
I know people have put a variety of comments into the chat, but unfortunately, I think we just kind of have to bring everything to an end.
Just was going to pick up on two comments that was made there. Somebody asked about a disappearing townland, I think in County Down, and testing the famine knowledge. It'd be interesting to look at the maps, look at the Ordnance Survey maps, and see when does that townland actually disappear, to see is it famine related. It'd be possible to do that very simply. And I see Trevor Martin, who does a lot of good work according to this on famine in County Down. Asking about the 1880s. God forbid COVID ever strikes again, but if it does, I'll look at the evictions of the land war period of the 1880s. But not until I get...
There's material on what they refer to as on Gortach Biog. The small famine in 1879, Armagh was badly hit. So we could look at that in relation to that. That's held in the Dublin, I think it's the Dublin City Library, actually. That they've got a major archive of that material.
Oh, that's right.
There was a question came up there about the Annesley estate in County Down. There's material relating to the Annesley estate in the Public Record Office in Belfast. So they actually had transcribed a lot of the material from 1845 to 1850 from the Annesley estate in round Banbridge and Scarva, that sort of direction, Loch Brickland, and it's in the Public Record Office.
Yeah.
And I know this is a subject for another evening, but just very quickly, if it can be quickly, in relation to the evictions during the Great Famine period and then the evictions in the 1880s, was there quite a difference in the style of the evictions? Were they a little bit less physically brutal?
Well, I suppose the most obvious one is the depictions of eviction. Emily Mark Fitzgerald is really good on this and has lectured on it. But the depiction of evictions during the land war will show an item being used, a battering ram. Now, I haven't come across any evidence that the battering ram was used during the Great Famine. So I suppose that could be one of the physical differences, is that the battering ram was used. It was done a lot quicker, and there doesn't seem to have been this engagement with local people doing the levelling during the land war period.
Would there have been the same amount of levelling?
I'm not sure. Again,
it takes research. Yeah,
researchers will answer that. Yeah.
And it again would potentially differ from area to area, depending on the landlord, etc. circumstances. Thank you, Ciarán. Jared, have you anything else to add before we finish?
No, great. I really enjoyed it. Very good. Thanks a million, Ciarán. Good to see you again.
You're welcome.
Thank you both very much. I think, again, like every talk, Ciarán, there's always another lecture coming out of it.